Ladies and gentlemen, the next session is The Mobility State, Perspectives on Policy and Regulation. Please welcome the Management Committee member for Foley and Lardner, LLP, Pavan Agarwal. President and Chief Executive Officer for the Center for Automotive Research, Carla Bailo. U.S. Senator Gary Peters. President and Chief Executive Officer for Property Casualty Insurers Association of America, David Sampson. And to moderate the discussion, the host of AutoLine, John McElroy.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. We've got a great panel here. We're going to be talking about mobility, this whole move to mobility and the disruption that it presents, not just for the automotive industry, not just for the state of Michigan, not just for the United States or the world in general, but really society. We've got 4 panelists, as I mentioned, that are going to be touching on this from a legal, from a technical and business, from a government, and from an insurance standpoint. And just to get the stage going here, imagine an automotive industry that can evolve to monetizing data, something that almost does not exist today, but in another 10 to 15 years could be worth $1 trillion. Imagine a world with 0 fatalities, 0 congestion, 0 emissions from automotive. But also imagine a world where we lose half of all our manufacturing capacity. Imagine a world in automotive where we lose tens of thousands of manufacturing jobs and driving jobs. So there's a lot of opportunity, there's a lot of threat, and that's what we're going to get into in today's panel discussion. Senator Peters, I want to start with you. What's your viewpoint of where we stand right now, especially as somebody who sits in the Senate? And I'll remind you, of course, that last September, the House of Representatives unanimously, listen to that, the House of Representatives unanimously enacted or passed a bill totally in favor of moving all this automated vehicle technology forward. So from the Senate standpoint, how do you see where we're going in that regard?
Well, we're continuing to move forward. We did pass the AV START Act, which is one that I authored with Senator Thune, who's the chair of the Commerce Committee, and that passed unanimously out of Senate committee. Unfortunately, it isn't on the Senate floor yet, so that's been an issue. What I have found is that there are a lot of folks who had a lot of issues related to this very complex piece of legislation and kind of charting where the future is going to be for this wonderful new technology. And folks who had some issues, they tend to descend on the Senate. So that's what we're trying to work through right now. We're waiting to get a, no pun intended, a vehicle bill to move it through the Senate. Hopefully by the end of this summer would be our goal, but I can't tell you that for sure.
What's the hang up in the Senate? I mean, if the House already passed it.
Well, part of it is getting floor time. The Senate floor time is a scarce commodity, particularly when you have all of the nominations and other types of work that is done. So the other option in the Senate is to try to pass it with unanimous consent, and we've put that on the calendar for unanimous consent. But to get 100 senators to agree is not an easy thing, and we have a few folks who still have issues. We're trying to work those out. We're having very positive, constructive conversations with them. I believe there is a path for us to get there with unanimous consent. We aren't there yet. So the other option is just to get it on the floor, but it won't be a bill by itself because of the way floor time is, so we'll be attached to another bill, and there are a couple of options that we're looking at to hopefully move it in the next few weeks, certainly by the end of the year.
Okay, I just wanted to get to that point. Now, where do you think that we stand as a state, Michigan, as we move into this world of mobility? How prepared are we? What more do we need to work on?
I think we're exceptionally prepared, but we have tough competition. You know, this is not something that you can sit on the past or look at the past. But when you look at the critical mass we have of engineering talent, something I'm very proud of talking about in Washington D.C. of having more engineers per capita than any other region of the country. I mean, that's a big deal. We know how to manufacture things, but we've got folks in Pittsburgh and in Austin and Boston and Silicon Valley. But it's interesting, a story I'd say, actually, when I was out in Silicon Valley, A couple years ago, because I've been immersed in this for quite some time, and talking to one of the big tech companies that is involved in the machine learning and the AI systems, they told me, they said, you know, Senator, we're designing these systems that are going to be able to navigate through a complex city environment. And we thought, you know, maybe we should just make the cars too. And then we went to Detroit. And then we went to an auto factory, and we said, wow, that's a really pretty complicated business. It's like, yes, it is. So they realized we have to partner with Detroit Autos, our domestic autos. Obviously, we have to partner with folks in Silicon Valley, but everybody wants to be around where you actually make stuff. You know, that's as you're doing the design and development, you got to be part of that manufacturing process. And that gives us a significant advantage over other areas of the country. And you're already seeing that with Google and Waymo, or related to Google. You've got NVIDIA, you've got Cisco, you've got Microsoft, all of them moving operations into Michigan. So that shows that we're building that critical mass. And I think things like the American Center for Mobility and M-City, where you can test this, you can get them out on the road, you have manufacturing. You've got these synergies that really put us at a great position. But we are also facing tough competition from the Chinese, from the Europeans. It's a bigger issue.
Pavan, how do you see it? How's Michigan ready? Especially, you represent the legal standpoint on this panel discussion.
Yeah, I am a lawyer, so I apologize for that, but we'll put that aside for a few minutes. But no, it's clearly there's an embraced collaboration that's going on between companies headquartered in Michigan and throughout the United States, and frankly throughout the world, and it has to be that way. You mentioned AI, Senator, and AI is a space where for traditional auto industry isn't as familiar, but there's a tremendous number of companies, both in the US and around the world, that are really pushing the ball forward, really pushing the envelope, and that's why you see, if you will, embraced collaboration. You've got to worry about who's ultimately responsible for the technology. That is from a standpoint of making sure it works. Who's responsible for that technology when somebody else comes saying, hey, you took my technology, you know, away from me. But be that as it may, I think that idea of embraced collaboration is definitely the right one.
Mm-hmm. Carla, your viewpoints on it, especially how's the state shaping up?
Yeah, pretty much when we look at the whole world, we're looking at the whole world's capability. The U.S. has been leading the way for a long, long time, especially in the area of autonomous connected vehicles. We clearly have the largest number of proving grounds and facilities that exist to do this kind of work. We also have the core competencies of the automakers as well as, you know, the startups in Silicon Valley. When you look at it from a full global perspective of all of the future of auto, electrification is probably heading towards the Chinese now, and all automakers are global. So when you think about the standards that need to be created, it's not going to just be a state by state, even though many states are opening their doors to allow that to happen. It has to be thought of as a global product, and certain things need to be tested at a global level. So we have to keep that in mind, and those collaborations, not only within the 50 contiguous states, but some of the relationships that Michigan is working as well with the other countries are going to be vital, so that we can solve all of the little issues and do all of the development that needs to be done in order to put these products on the road in a safe manner.
David, your thoughts?
Well, first of all, I would say I think Michigan is very well positioned. As an outsider, I kind of take at least a national look. And I think
you're speaking as a Texan here, right?
Yeah, I'm speaking as a Texan, but I have a national responsibility. So because of the industry cluster, the expertise that exists here, the attention of the governmental leadership, I think Michigan is very well positioned. You know, I would just point out that mobility in Michigan and the insurance industry have had a symbiotic relationship for over 100 years. I mean, they really have grown up together, and as products have evolved and changed and been widely deployed, the insurance industry, the automotive insurance industry has grown and innovated as well. And I think that relationship will continue. I think the critical element for success here is that we need a regulatory environment that can move at the speed of innovation. And that's a real challenge.
It's an impossibility.
I'm sorry?
I believe it's an impossibility.
Well, it's going to have to. If this is going to reach its potential, then it's going to have to change because
Here's why I say that. NHTSA will tell you it takes 6 to 8 years to write a rule that goes in the books. FMVSS, Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standard. 6 to 8 years. Who knows what technology we're going to have there? So how do you move legislation at the speed of technology?
well, I think that I'll let the senator speak, but I think
No, finish your thought.
But I think that the AV START Act is a really good start, no pun intended.
And what is that?
Well, that's his piece of legislation, so I'll let you speak to it, Senator.
Keep talking about how good it is. That's good.
Well, one of the best parts of that, I'll let him talk about the regulatory structure, but one of the elements of that I think is critical is it calls for a federal advisory committee to work with NHTSA and the other federal agencies that brings the automotive industry together, the insurance industry together, and other critical players so that everyone's around the table at the same time while this process is moving forward. And I think that is one critical component to answering your question. But the insurance industry today is more data-driven than ever before, wanting to innovate, wanting to use telematics, and yet in many states, we are held back by an insurance regulatory structure, because insurance is fundamentally regulated at the state level, that is incapable of moving at the speed that insurance companies are prepared to move to actually use this technology in providing products and services to consumers.
Real good. Gary, how do you move legislation forward at the speed of technology?
By creating a great deal of flexibility in the legislation, basically, is the way to do it.
So more guidelines than hardcore legislation?
Absolutely, because it's always a changing bar. It's like, and we're going to be dealing with cybersecurity, for example, in this as well. You know, you can't set a cyber standard today because tomorrow it's definitely going to be obsolete. So it's got to be constantly evolving going forward. And so a regulatory scheme has to account for that. What we are dealing with the AV START Act is that we allow waivers to the Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Act, which of course is a very detailed piece of regulation. It requires things like a steering wheel, an A through Z. It requires brake pedals, A through Z. Those are really good things if there's humans driving those cars, but these cars will not have a steering wheel. They're not going to have brake pedals, so they're all out of compliance with those regulations. So our act allows a waiver from those, so you can get them out on the road and start testing them. But there's still checklists that automakers have to go through. So there's going to be a safety checklist. We're making it mandatory, not voluntary. There's voluntary standards right now. We don't think that's right. We should have mandatory reporting so that companies are thinking about all of the aspects of safety before they put that car out. Certainly the automakers want to have that. They want to make sure that everybody who's testing these vehicles is really ready for prime time to get them out. You know, every accident that occurs is not a good thing for a variety of reasons, but certainly could set the whole industry back if you have players that are putting vehicles out that haven't met some certain basic criteria. And then at that point, as they get out, you collect more data. And you can refine those regulations, which will take several years, but you need to have a database going forward. And I actually think that this legislation that we are moving through is a model not just for self-driving cars, it's a model for all of the technologies across the board. I mean, we're living in an incredibly exciting time, from synthetic biology to nanobots to additive manufacturing. You know, innovation is going like this, and public policy is on its normal course, which is like that, snail pace. So, you know, that's not a good model. So you've got to create the flexibility to let it go, but also understand we've got to make sure we're dealing with some of the safety issues. But that means we will get to that regulation, but understand you can't get it right out of the box. It's not going to happen.
Pavan, how's that going to play out legally? Guidelines, exemptions, that sort of thing?
Yeah, no, I think it can be a very helpful approach because, as we see, the law takes some time to catch up to the technology. And as long as you have something that's flexible, allows you to interact with each other and interact with companies in a way that you can sort of see where you have to be regulatory-wise, but you're not going to slow down what really is, you know, a tremendous technology that's just going to change the way a car is and the way that we transport. Then that's very helpful, both from a regulatory standpoint. It allows us as attorneys to help facilitate our clients' needs to collaborate with other companies and sort of know that the investments that they're making are going to be meaningful and they're not going to get the knees cut out from under them. And then also, looking at the technology, see that it's worth spending the time to protect it, and then spending the time to build, vehicles and products around it.
So I think there's opportunity here to do some regulatory triage. You identify those areas where you allow a lot of flexibility based on testing, and then there are other areas like the crash protection standards that you referenced that you want to make sure those are mandatory, that those are preserved. And so I think if you do some regulatory triage here, you can get there.
Yeah.
And the key is we don't know what we don't know. So as we continue to learn more through testing, through validation, through some of the guidelines that are established, we can begin to cement in those and put some clarity into really, what should the redundancy in systems be? How much testing is enough? Because no one knows. And if we try to over-regulate and put too many controls on it today, it will simply hamper those discoveries. But it needs to be done safely, which brings us to a lot of the contained testing that fortunately our state has a lot of opportunity to drive more of the contained, do the research in a safe environment, figure out what the guidelines need to be, then go out and do a lot of work on the public roads.
And that's what's really great, because Michigan obviously being, the birthplace, if you will, of the auto industry, the tremendous amount of know-how that really exists among the collaboration in the state, and allows you to move that ball forward much faster. Tech companies are extremely smart. They can do that slice, but what they can't do as well that you can have an auto OEM do is bring it all together, test it in a safe environment, but balance that by knowing that the technology is here and it's going to move forward that much faster.
So I was going to say, the other question here is, so what is the standard for safety? Must the technology be as safe as the current distracted driver, or is it a zero tolerance? Which is really a big question, because today's cars are safer than ever before because of the crash avoidance technology and everything, and yet we're seeing for the first time in 50 years a reversal in highway fatalities, and it's because the human element, even though cars are safer, be careful what I'm saying here, human behavior is out-trumping, oh, no pun there either, is out-trumping the intelligence of the cars, and so what's the safety standard? Is it a zero? Is it a zero defect, or what's it going to be? And all of those are critical questions to resolve in this testing phase.
Carla, you were going to say?
The interesting thing to me there is, yes, cars are safer than they've ever been, and we're putting all kinds of advanced driver avoidance system technology, but 65% of people are turning it off.
Yep.
Because they don't understand it, and because it's beeping at them and annoying them. So we need to do a better job with having the public understand the technology that's there to protect them, but still you have the human brain, and that's a crapshoot. And 94% of the problems come from that human brain error.
Yeah, and I just pick up on that because we're in a kind of the real dangerous phase of getting to the level 4 and 5, which are the fully automated cars. Is that there's limitations to what these automobiles can do, and yet, to your point, Carla, is that a human being will think, well, I can just sit back and relax. I don't have to be situationally aware. There's all sorts of mechanisms that are being put in place now to try to wake you up or shake the wheel or whatever it may be that you have to take control. So part of our legislation, actually, is that we're really making sure, and we'll push aggressively, that manufacturers are doing everything they can to educate their customers as to what this car can and what it can't do. You have to have full disclosure. Some of the accidents that we've seen with one manufacturer, people thought it could do a whole lot more than it really could, and they found out the hard way that that's not the case. And your point about having the zero tolerance, we have to get close to that in the early stages because of consumer acceptance is still like, I don't want to get in a car and have it, drive itself. And I know when you talk about autonomous cars, I know that's been tested. Folks really are afraid of autonomous cars because it sounds like you just get in the car and it takes you where it wants to go, you know, and no one wants that. So self-driving is a much friendlier term, but even with a friendlier term of self-driving, people are not used to giving up that kind of control. So when you do see an accident, we had one recently, that gets big national attention. What didn't get attention was that a whole lot more people died that day on the highways. And 94% of all of the accidents are human error, and close to 40,000 people are dying on our highways, and hundreds of thousands of people have debilitating injuries. I mean, that's really, when you put it in those terms, there's carnage on our highways that we've seemed to accept. This is a way to really reduce that in a significant way. There'll still be accidents. You can't have zero tolerance. But this is literally going to save tens of thousands of lives. But we have to get through this stage where people are building confidence before we get to the fully self-driving level 4 and 5, and that's what I worry about.
Yeah, I want to just interject here that the Society of Automotive Engineers did a very interesting study where they took some autonomous cars down to the state of Florida, and they brought in members of the public to go around and see what they thought of them. They did a pre-interview and asked them, what do you think of autonomous cars? 80% of them very leery about getting into it. After they drove around in these autonomous cars, they did a post-survey. They found that 85% of them said they feel safe enough to put their kids in and let them go to school. So a lot of it's just education, exposure, and experience.
Right.
And Florida is a state that could really use this technology because it is always, we track this on a quarterly basis, and over the last 2 years, Florida has had the worst increase in frequency and severity of auto accidents. It's always in the top 10 states with the worst trends.
Well, demographics drive so much of it, and that's one thing that we got to be careful of about this rising accident rate. The population of the U.S. continues to grow. The car population continues to grow. Right now in 2018, there are 40 million more people living in the United States than there were in the year 2000. We have something like 275 million vehicles in the United States right now. That's about 15 million more than there was just a decade ago. So we got to make sure that we're not confusing population and auto park growth with a rising rate of accidents just in and of itself. But I just throw that in. David, I want to come back to you. There's a sense that the insurance industry is really in deep trouble as this technology moves forward. When you have, even before we get to full autonomy, this whole concept of ADAS, Advanced Driver Assistance Systems, automated emergency braking and that sort of thing. What's the insurance industry think about this technology coming?
Well, first of all, the insurance industry has been promoting auto and highway safety for many, many years. We founded the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety well over 50 years ago and continue to fund that. I sit on the board of the Institute. And so we are all for anything that can make the roads, cars safer, reduce frequency and severity of accidents. And so generally I would say that is, we want to promote this innovation. Will the nature of insurance change as highly autonomous vehicles are deployed? Yes, it probably will. More of it may go toward commercial policies as opposed to personal lines policies. If you listen to the vision that Don outlined just a little bit ago about mobility on demand, and insurance companies are thinking of this in real time right along with the auto manufacturers. So the nature of the insurance products will change, but there are always going to be accidents, and people are always going to need to have insurance. There will still be storm damage and all of the kinds of things that need to be insured in addition to accidents. And so I'm very optimistic that the insurance industry is going to be able to adapt and innovate right along with the mobility changes in the country.
Some people have talked about the car companies may have to self-insure, that otherwise they're not going to be able to afford it. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that different companies will have different models on that. I think that that's certainly one of the things that I've discussed with certain OEMs. It remains to be seen in my mind, and I think in the minds of many of the CEOs of the insurance companies that I represent, how does that work as a business model if that cost has to be embedded in the cost of the vehicle from the very beginning? So I think that's an open question.
And for some of us that deal in the space, what's really interesting is that because the nature of the car is changing from what's traditionally purely mechanical, electromechanical, to say 50% of it is mechanical, but that much more is going to be hardware and more software that you update all the time. We're advising clients related to cybersecurity, related to insurance, who ultimately owns this, who's responsible when the car updates, because traditional cars, as you know, platforms take 5 to 6 years from start to actually put into the market, and now we can update our car tomorrow. Some of our cars are being updated, sitting out there, maybe not in this island, but sitting out there right now. And so, we've got a lot of these kinds of legal issues that we've got to deal with, that companies have to deal with, and I think that sort of falls along the lines of the insurance industry.
We're going to see a fundamental paradigm shift, because while vehicle characteristics have always been a part of the underwriting criteria for insurance, fundamentally, the industry has underwritten the driver and the driver's behavior. And now, as that shifts, insurance is going to be fundamentally underwritten on the basis of the technology platform and the updates.
Yeah, and I'd like to pick up on it because I think it's a very important point. As it goes back to our discussion of regulations keeping up with kind of the changes and how do you keep raising the bar, that's where the insurance industry, and you mentioned it, will play such an important role. Because if you're just insuring driver error, that's pretty hard to have any kind of control. That's just basically a actuarial kind of function, because we know that's innate in human behavior. But when you're actually ensuring best practices of a technology, the market mechanism will be incredibly powerful. That whoever is going to have that liability, that manufacturer, that computer provider, whatever it may be, the software provider, you'll be able to drive that much quicker and much more responsive way than regulation. So that's kind of brought back to this model of how do you create flexibility. You have the government involved in protecting highways, but I think you're going to see insurance playing an even bigger role in mitigating risk, which is their business. That's what they do. So I think it's a very positive one.
And it's going to be very hard in states that require insurance companies to file rating forms, and it takes 6 to 8 months to a year to get those approved. When you're looking at the kind of deployment of technology, that's why I'm saying there's a mismatch.
Right.
And we're going to have to address the regulatory system.
Right, with that.
But a lot of it will be driven by the market itself as well. That is by business contracts, the determination of who's going to be responsible. Is it going to be the company that developed the software, that went into the base chip, that went into the GPS system, that ultimately went into the car? Or is it going to be the automaker? Or is it going to be simply the purchaser? And what are the standards for, as you said, is it zero tolerance? Unfortunately, I think zero tolerance is a great goal, but if we required it, then the entire change stops.
So what's going to happen, Pavan? How do you see it going? Is it going to, I think everyone who had anything to do with an autonomous system is going to be liable. That's my opinion, but you're the legal expert. What do you think?
It depends who I'm representing. No, I apologize.
I like that answer.
There's just so
A good lawyer.
Yeah, good lawyer.
I don't represent any of my partners in this. Any jokes or bad jokes are just mine. But I think a lot of it ends up through contracts. Yeah, I think that the government will have some level of regulation that's in there that will set certain standards. And if you breach those standards, then the company that breached them will be liable. On the other hand, I think through private party agreements, determination of indemnification or of ownership of technology and responsibility. And the fact is, some companies will simply step up because their entire company rides on the advancement of that technology and its acceptance in the marketplace.
How do you indemnify a company that came up with some piece of technology or software that maybe failed or contributed or is even a part of something that failed and stand clear and free in a court of law? How do you do that?
Yeah, well, that's where sometimes, if you say there's the legal side and then there's the business side of what happens, still at the end of the day, automotive OEMs have a tremendous amount of business power, if you will, and sort of business know-how, and they're able to ultimately get the relationship and ensure that the company that develops some of that technology will stand up to it. But you're right, what's different now, I think, is technology companies when you go out Silicon Valley, and I'm just talking, say, some pure high-tech company, because obviously so many of them are here as well, they see it differently. It's a different mindset. This idea that, oh, I did this, so I'm responsible, not always the case. You know, the contracts are written differently, and there's some willingness to just go ahead and let the business relationship go.
Silicon Valley companies have never been sued like automotive companies have. I think they're about to go through a rude awakening of what it's like to do business in the automotive industry.
And John, I think you're 100% correct. When something happens, everybody's going to get sued, and then it's going to be figured out, and we're going to learn from it.
But I'm not going to say okay for big, large companies like a General Motors, a Toyota, a Volkswagen, but for some small startup, it would kill them. Is that what's going to happen?
Well, I think the other question that has to be answered, and nobody can answer it today, is how good is good enough? So even the smallest companies are going to have to validate to some level, whatever we decide that level is. And does that mean it has to be as good as a human driver today? And how do we measure that? Because we have drivers all over the map, right? So, or does it have to be better? And if so, how much better? So these are the things that I really think working collaboratively with the agencies and the automakers to learn and decide what those are. Also learning from other industries like the aviation industry, where they've had, you know, fly-by-wire for some time and autopilot for some time. The problem with duplicating what they've done is their drivers are much better trained than automobile drivers are. So we have to be careful about copy and pasting, but we can learn from other industries that have already done it. And then determining what that bar is, what that standard needs to be, and regardless what kind of product and how large your company is, you have to meet that standard.
Why can't we have some sort of computer program that says, okay, before you can put an autonomous car on the road, you got to plug your autonomous system into this computer that's going to run it through a battery of tests. And as long as you avoid these accidents, simulated accidents that we throw at you, your system's probably safe enough to put on the road right now.
Oh, I think there's a tremendous amount of testing already being done. So, you know, whether it's in a supercomputer, AI.
No. What I'm getting at here, yeah, Pavan, is that, you know, look at the accidents that Tesla's had. Look at the accidents that Uber has had. Mm-hmm. We should have run those systems through a battery of tests and said yay or nay as to whether they can operate on the road. You're right, yeah, there's a lot of testing done, but I think we're seeing some companies cut corners in a race to be first to the market, maybe in a race to juice their stock price. Go ahead, Gary.
Which is why we need the AV Start Act, is that right now you can get these waivers and have a limited number of cars and put them out on the road that have not gone through those kinds of safety checks. So the accidents we've had has not been under the regulatory framework we have in our legislation. We think it's necessary to have that. It has to be mandatory. Now, the trade-off we have is we allow car companies to produce a lot more vehicles once they meet those criteria. Right now, it's only 2,500 without any kind of oversight. That's good for testing, but not good for putting into production. And Ford wants to put out, you know, tens of thousands of cars. You need some certainty as to what that is. But that's part of what we're aiming to do with AV Start, is to make sure you don't have these small startup companies that are putting automobiles out that aren't ready, that get into an accident, because the consumer blowback on a series of accidents, we've already seen some with the ones we've seen. If you had another major accident, or you can imagine a truck that's self-driving that plows into a minivan with a family, the consumer outrage will be extreme. It'll come to me and my colleagues in Congress, and all of the companies that have invested billions of dollars into this technology will be put at risk as well. So that's why we have to have some of these mandatory standards now that everyone applies before they put them out on the road, and basically run some of those tests that you're mentioning, but the OEMs and others will be doing that. Mm-hmm.
Part of the question is, as well, can we ever rely on a human to take control of the vehicle and to manage it? What we saw in a number of the accidents that have happened already is the human couldn't do it.
Or didn't.
And a lot of the data that we see today, if a human is distracted, it can take anywhere from 4 or 5 seconds all the way to 30 seconds for them to re-engage and react. Well, yeah, they're long dead at that point. I mean,
but
calamity
this is where I come back to companies cutting corners. So in the Tesla autopilot system, it will warn you, but it will not disconnect. Everybody else disconnects the system. There's nothing that grabs the driver's attention more than all of a sudden the car starts slowing down. Then they look up and say, what the hell's going on here? And when you look at the Uber thing, they had disabled the safety systems built into the car from the factory. Yep. And so that's where I'm getting at, is I think we're seeing some companies cut corners for whatever reasons that they want to rush this stuff to the market for.
Right.
You know, the point about learning from other industries, I think, is a very important one, and you mentioned aviation specifically. There are capabilities to improve throughput in the nation's air traffic control system that technologically are available today, and yet it's been, how many years have we been trying to get the next gen air traffic control system through, that there's political resistance, there is resistance from labor groups and a number of other issues there. There's, I think, a gap between what is technologically possible and then what is politically feasible or the market will accept. And then the other point about you know, the driver taking over, I know there's some concern that that pilots are losing their actual flying skills because they become so reliant upon the technology in the planes that when something goes wrong, there is concern about how current is the ability to actually fly the plane. And there may be some analogs there that we need to think through with passengers in automobiles as well.
But there's just a level of acceptance. I mean, everybody knows about the accident that occurred in Arizona. But today, there will be so many teens texting while driving, causing accidents. And not one person in this room, unless you're related to them, is going to think twice about it. The fact is, the technology is way safer. You know, Tesla's technology, we're paying attention to the one accident. Uber, we're paying attention to the accident. Understood. But the fact is, the kinds of things that are being developed out there, and Mr. Butler spoke about some of them, the way we get around is going to be so much better. The question is simply whether, as insurers, as you know, folks in the government, folks like myself, we're there to facilitate and move it move it forward to that point of level 5. Because at level 5, nobody's disabling anything. You know, there's nothing. You do nothing but sit there, and now you can text and sit.
Yeah, well, it's interesting, you know, Waymo, the spinoff from Google, and the Ford Motor Company have said, we're not doing level 3, level 4. The handoff to the driver scares the hell out of us.
Extremely dangerous.
We're going straight to level 5.
Right.
And I wonder if that's not the way that the industry will go. But it comes back to this moral dilemma. I think, David, you might have been the one that raised it. How good is good? Are we going to let really, really good be the enemy of perfect? And this is one of my concerns right now is, and we're hearing it a lot from the safety advocates, they want this system to be perfect before it's deployed. And I'm saying, in the meantime, we slaughter tens of thousands of people. So how can we tolerate this mass carnage waiting for these systems to be perfect? And guess what? They're never going to be perfect. Gary?
Well, and that's, you asked some of the things that are slowing down the legislation. It is. We have safety groups who are very concerned, and we appreciate all the great work that they do, but they keep setting the goalposts, keep moving through that, and that's part of that political process. And I say the same thing to them. I understand where you're trying to go, and I want to figure out ways to make that happen. But every month, every year that goes by, there's tens of thousands of people who are dying that we could very well save. You've got to look at the safety picture in a much more comprehensive way.
People a lot smarter than me are thinking about this, I'm sure, but I think the answer is a rigorous testing program in controlled circumstances that then you move to real life roads on a ring-fenced basis with certain applications. And I think generationally there's going to be a greater acceptance as that demonstrates its real life capabilities on the streets. And my guess is that this will be deployed more in the commercial space originally than the personal lines space. And I think all of these are building blocks to gaining trust in the technology as well as trust from elected officials, regulators, and the marketplace.
Okay, we've been, sorry, go ahead,
Just
Carla.
one quick comment about that. I'm an automotive engineer, and I can guarantee you every model I worked on was perfectly designed. Perfect. I can also guarantee you that every one of them had a warranty or service recall campaign. It just happens. You cannot test all of the variations, all the end cases that exist, no matter how many products you put on the roadway, things happen. So to say it has to be perfect is a misnomer. It's really impossible. But we do need to have that set of standards that every automaker, regardless, has to test to. And then we will find things. That's just the nature of vehicles and automation, but quickly we can fix those.
Gary, at the top of this conversation, you talked about a lot of the things that are going on in Michigan, really positive. And yet, from a perception standpoint, even within this state, we're not perceived as leaders in this move to mobility. What's it going to take?
Well, it's going to take something even broader, I think, than just the engineering talent. I'll just give you a story of something that just happened recently. I serve on the Armed Services Committee, and when we're thinking about automation and AI, if you think of what that's going to do to the domestic auto market, just imagine what that does to warfare. We're going to see the F-35 fighter that we have will probably be the last fighter aircraft that will ever have a human pilot in it. You're likely to see swarms of tanks and swarms of aircraft that are piloted with AI systems. It's a brave new world that we're heading to. It's going to be very challenging. And Michigan actually has an advantage with TARDAC, which does very advanced work for the U.S. Army. But the U.S. Army is looking at creating a futures command to realize that they've got to go where this technology is happening. It's not going to happen through the Department of Defense. It's going to happen in commercial businesses is where most of that's going to happen. So they wanted to locate where they thought was going to be a place for that. The Michigan was on the list of top 20 sites. They went to 15 and we fell off the list. 15 sites for automation, for futures, for all this advanced technology that we were extolling right now. It was particularly frustrating given the fact that Secretary Mattis, the Secretary of Defense, was actually at an Army conference and said the 4 places where innovation is occurring in America is Austin, Texas, Boston, Silicon Valley, and Michigan. So we were on the list of 4 from Secretary Mattis, but we didn't make the list of 15 for the Department of Army for their Futures Command. And they used 4 criteria. They used talent, and we ranked somewhere like 7 or 8. They have advanced research at universities. We were 8 or 9. STEM research and education, we were in that 7 or 8. And if you put them all together, we ranked probably 5th or 6th in the technical aspects. But the 4th criteria was livability. And livability was determined by the AARP Livability Index. And that actually knocked us out of running completely, even though we were in the top 10 of those categories. What really frustrated me too was that then the 5th category wasn't used yet, and that was cost. And I expressed to the Secretary of Army that it's a lot cheaper to do this in Detroit than San Francisco or Boston. And if we're already in the top 5, we would be right there, right up top. But when you think about this livability index, that's being used. It was McKinsey that did it. So they're doing that not just for the Department of Army, but for other companies around the country. We've got to realize that it's not just having the best engineers. It's not just having the best academic institutions. It's dealing with all these other livability things like the environment and access to healthcare, transportation, down the list of things. And that incident should give us a roadmap of what we have to do to really bring it so that people from other parts of the country want to come to Michigan because they know it's a very livable place, in addition to having this incredible intellectual talent we have.
Carla,
yeah, I
your
think
thoughts?
it's really, really important that we take a look at what are some of the problems that are identified with either underserved communities and or some of the senior communities, and we seek to solve those. Is it transportation to education? Is it access to jobs, access to health care? We have the capability with the know-how in our automotives to create the mobility services to help solve those problems. So I think we need to start showing what we're talking about.
How do we show that? Because that would change the perception.
Basically, you need to partner with, let's say, a senior community. Let me just give an example. A senior community, and you start a service, one of the automakers starts a service that allows them to get to their prescriptions, allows them to get to the grocery store, allows them to go have coffee with their friends, gives them that independence they crave. That or working with persons with disabilities, with a disabled community, same kind of thing. And then just put it on YouTube, put it in social media, broadcast it everywhere.
David, quick thoughts on this?
Well, it sounds to me like the Secretary of the Army had a grudge against the Marine General. But no, I mean, look, I think that having had responsibility for economic development in the state of Texas and working with these corporate site selectors, it's always been very, very frustrating to me, some of the criteria that are used that seem to me to be very artificial. I mean, from an outside observer, I think Michigan is highly, highly competitive, and I think the trajectory that Michigan is on has been pretty remarkable over the last number of years, and I think getting that story out is just is one component of that, and it's not very, it's just sometimes hard work grinding that out, getting to the people at McKinsey and these other economic development consulting firms to bring them in and have these conversations with them.
Pavan, under a minute.
Yeah, I would just add, I still think Michigan remains a center for automotive development. Yeah, the base is broader. There's a tremendous number of joint ventures and the like, but Detroit, Michigan, still attracting so many of those, and the fact is it's going to remain that way for some time to come. There's a lot of fanfare in other parts of the country, but I think as long as there's an acceptance that that's what it is, and maybe you're still sort of the quarterback rather than the entire team, I still think we're in great shape.
That's great. Look, we've had a great conversation here. I hope we started some thinking out amongst you in the audience about how we get Michigan to remain at the forefront of this move, because it's going to be terrific and it's going to be very disruptive. But thank you very much, and a warm round of applause for the panel.